so much for joining us on this Sunday for this In Conversation. I'll just kick off by acknowledging the land that we are on. In Manton, we are on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and becoming, and acknowledge that the First Nation sovereignty of this land was never ceded. Today, we have an In Conversation with Louis Lim, our philosopher in residence, and Andrew Browne, who's responsible for this beautiful exhibition. Andrew is quite a well-regarded artist throughout Australia and has exhibited quite prolifically over the last 3 decades. But this is his first solo show in Brisbane and first solo show with Jenny Manton. So, yes, and so we're very glad to have him in our stable and to have him here today to talk to Elaine. So I'll hand over to the two of you.
Thank you. Thanks, No.
Thank you.
All right, Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
Brisbane. Yeah, I didn't realise it's your first solo show in Brisbane.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
There's been some group presentations and things over the years.
Okay.
Like touring shows and things that have come through Brisbane. But
this is
the first time they've stopped for a while.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
And welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this Sunday afternoon. So the exploration today, so MB, who works here, writes to me like a couple of weeks before and says, so, what's the theme? And I thought the glimpse, which I got from you, and self-divergence. So in this continued exploration of affect, because affect is a topic that I'm particularly interested in, and I keep investigating it in each of these sort of In Conversation talks that I do, we're inquiring into the metaphysics of time. So the glimpse and self-divergence as related themes. So to kick us off, why not sort of go straight in and start with a quote from Deleuze from his book Nietzsche and Philosophy. So the quote is, "Return is the being of becoming, the unity of multiplicity, the necessity of change, the being of difference, the eternal return." And I start off with this quote, Andrew, because it seems relevant to your exhibition. And I pick out, I believe in the booklet or brochure, you write, the title Time's Tide acknowledges the passage of time and attendant mortality. But it underlines a contradiction between the Western concept of time's arrow and the state of perpetual movement forward, with its inevitable elegiac undertone, and the cyclical nature of tide's forever return, inherent in multifarious aspects of the natural world. So could you please elaborate on the notion of forever return? I like that.
Well, look, it was sort of curious. I suppose I was trying to bring it back, like rationalizing the subject of these works.
Yeah.
The mortality aspect we can talk about in a separate sort of context. But as someone who was educated in the 70s and sort of resisted landscape painting for many years,
okay,
just on the most straightforward level, at various times in my practice across my history, I've kind of touched on it and then resisted and moved away. So it's kind of been like this, and it's partly tied to my interest in both abstraction and figuration and sort of basically the zone between them. But with these pictures, I was sort of aware that I'd sort of there's sort of a coda to a number of other periods of my work across the last couple of decades where I've kind of gone back into the landscape to look at that defined subject. So this idea of trying to like figure out, well, first of all, trying to justify within myself why am I back in a sort of a landscape sort of mode, having moved the work into possibly a more abstract and more graphic or schematic sort of a style. And I sort of thought about age and thought about how we, as we develop our language over many years, over decades, we can't just sort of abandon it as we move forward. In fact, you can actually go back. You can move back through it like a cyclical sort of process back, and maybe go back and grab some of the material that was there that maybe that you felt you dealt with, but in fact you hadn't. But this, I suppose, relates to psychology as well. I mean, we feel we deal with all our psychological issues, but in fact they're still there, humming away. And So in a sense, that the psychological relationship to my motivation and landscape, it becomes this, a cycle. So that's kind of me rationalising why the work has emerged like this. I mean, there's a whole lot of other reasons as well, which I could go into, but that's like a primary thing.
Sure.
My mother passed away late last year while I was working on this work, and that of course made me think more about time as well, and how life is like a series of glimpses, really. As you move forward, you think what happened, where did it all go, and you tend to look at your history not as this sort of long, complex. I see it as like this series of episodes, really. So
I'm picking up 2 layers there, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, with the title, I was trying to put one, as you said, in your initial introduction there. I was trying to get this idea that yes, we're plummeting forward into the future all the time, but we can go back and we can grab things as we go, I suppose, and sort of take them with us again, move forward with them, with new things over our shoulders.
Yeah, and that's one of the layers I'm picking up, is you returning to, let's say landscape, or those themes. But also the other layer that I pick up is in the work itself, where it is inviting the viewer to consider the cyclical nature of time.
Sure. Yeah. Well, these pictures are deliberately not pernickety in their figuration or trying to describe every element of a wave or of a branch. They're that glimpse aspect, they're deliberately open in that sense, that I didn't want to close them down and turn them into illustration. I wanted them to stay sort of, I talk about the mutable. Help me with that.
Go with mutable.
You work in an art school. Sorry, mutable,
yes.
In the sense of changing, ever changing,
sure.
Hard to pin down. And I kind of wanted them to be a bit like that, really. I suppose I used these borders, which a few people have remarked upon, was my kind of a way. It's like a nod to sort of pinning something down by putting them into this crisp edge, like something which is quite mutable.
Yes.
In relation to its relationship to the surface and the effect of light and water. By putting this device on, I kind of see it as a device, really, but also like a nod back to the picture plane and abstraction. It's a way of sort of nailing that in a sense. So it was kind of, I wanted them to, there was a sort of a point where there's a little picture around the corner, the little golden landscape, riverscape I should say, which I made very quickly, which, I'm not meant to say I made things very quickly. That was made in like an hour and a half or 2 hours, and it just kind of breathed on, and I was kind of just right as far as it got exactly the feeling I wanted in that time. Yes. And I sort of, in a sense, that picture is truest to the idea of that glimpse where you just grab that sensation, that moment, that image, and just allow it to be, and not go in and sort of start to fiddle around with everything.
Okay.
Even though, curiously, because not necessarily with these works, but with a lot of my work, people say, "Oh, you must labour them over so long," and da-da-da, and they're so exact. And like for me, I've kind of enjoyed making this group because I've rather than going in and finessing bits and pieces of them, I've kind of just let them be, I think, which for me is kind of fresher in some respects.
And we'll come back to this notion of the glimpse.
You must stop me when I just go off on a tangent.
No, that's what I'm here for, just to kind of set you off. So let's turn to some Shakespeare. So in Act 1, Scene 5 of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Hamlet utters these words after he is visited by the ghost of his late father. He says, "Let us go in together, and still your fingers on your lips, I pray. The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set right. Nay, come, let's go together." So we're quite familiar with the story and we know how it ends. Yet there's something of a mystery in it, and something that Deleuze picks out in his philosophy of this time being out of joint. So I put out the question, is Hamlet's destiny pre-given and passive, or is Hamlet an active force in his own destiny? I'm not going to get you to attempt to answer that, but we'll let it kind of sit there.
Sure.
So the reason I ask this is because you say in your write-up, a primary intent is locating the image within an emblematic phenomenal field, and to invite the viewer to see the world as if in a glimpse through your eyes, or as Beckett puts it, to find a form that accommodates the mess of the world. And I'm drawing a parallel here between Hamlet seeing the ghost of his late father and the viewer catching a glimpse of the world through your work. I hope that's okay. And at such a point, so you can imagine the viewer viewing your work, is the viewer's destiny pre-given, or do they become an active force in how they interact with the work?
Yeah, well, this is the whole issue around sort of modernism and late modern, and to where we are now with art. That, and particularly when I think about Duchamp and a whole lot of artists, that they saw ultimately the artwork gets activated in the end by the viewer, the audience.
Yeah.
The artist will take it to a point, but then the activation happens with the audience's response to it. And I don't think, I mean, that's a given now, I think. You know, you can, I mean, work that's highly figurative or highly symbolic, and then there's a sort of, you have to analyze the symbolism, and work like that, you know, directs the audience towards a very specific point.
Yeah.
Whereas with these, I wanted these to be open. I mean, they're obviously, you know, subjects around river landscapes and silhouettes and trees and things, but you know, I want them to be open enough that people can insert themselves into them, really. And that's kind of, and that's why some of them like deal with this sort of the cusp or the edge between figuration and abstraction. And that's why, you know, I was talking earlier about not wanting to be illustrative, because once they become very illustrative, they, you know, they kind of lock everything in pretty much. And I didn't want these pictures to lock the responses that people might have in. Like a whole history of my work has been kind of this kind of collision between abstraction and figuration, and taking the formal qualities of abstraction and marrying them to figurative subject. And they sort of rise and fall according to sort of, you know where I am and what the previous work is, and maybe where I see it going forward.
Sure.
But just on that key point about, you know, whether it's about the active audience. Sure. I can only take them so far.
Yeah.
I've taken them this far, and people have to take them further, I suppose.
And have you had any, or has anyone shared their responses with you in terms of what's been activated for them?
Some people just go, oh, they're beautiful, or you know. But you know, the more curatorial artist end, you know, they start to get into the, you know, they start to talk about photography, obviously, and they start talking about edges, and. I was talking, Robert Lennon was here, who's the new IMA director. He was here, and he was intrigued by these edges. So we're talking about how I was trying to step the pictures, make, you know, because I think, you know, even the frame in this picture, all these pictures are quite active, and I was very thoughtful about that. And you know, when I decided on the device, I also knew that it would be stepped down from that. So he was kind of intrigued about how that worked as a kind of separation.
Sure.
Like, if these pictures were painted right to the edge, I think they'd work in a totally different way. And they'd probably veer too much into a kind of a neo-romanticism, which,
yeah,
you know, I kind of, you know, it's very engaging and everything, but I kind of slightly revolted by them becoming too kind of neo-romantic, because it's kind of feels soft to me.
Yeah.
So I kind of felt with these in particular, I mean, there was a series of big waterfall pictures which I made several years ago, which they went to the edge, and they were these very beautiful cascades, but they were very dark, heavy pictures. So they managed to avoid that neo-romantic. They took it off into an uncanny, sort of weird, sort of almost not grotesque, but some strange, heavy mood.
Okay.
So they were sort of rescued by that. So, you know, it's and this gets back to my earlier point right at the beginning about, you know, how I avoided landscape as a subject for many years because I can just see it, that you get into kind of a genre, you get into this sort of sentimental genre, which, you know, I don't want my work to engage. So if you had to scroll through my website, for instance, looked at the history of my paintings across the last 40 years really, which I think there's about 40 years worth of images there. You'll see there's a lot of episode jumping around within that process as well. And it's kind of like I take things to a certain point and then I've sort of kind of almost got to sort of flip the whole work. And it may be that this work will flip, you know, after this. Because I do see this as a very complete body of work. I mean, they're all relating to a very specific river. And I've accumulated a lot of material over many years. You know, in the form mainly of photography, but also in sort of, you know, it also bubbles away in here and in, you know, the odd notation.
I do want to talk about this device, this edge, and specifically in that painting there, where it's asymmetrical. Do you want to tell us about that? How did that happen?
Yeah, well, I'd already started. This relates to an earlier picture, first of all, but I can return to that. There is a picture which I made in 2016, which was exhibited at Tolano in Melbourne. And then I heavily reworked in 2019. When I say heavily reworked, I obliterated the image with black, Mars black, and then wiped the whole thing back. So the whole picture went from being quite a sort of a, you know, this sort of, that sort of light that's out there into a very dark nocturnal picture.
Okay.
But it had that device in it, and the device, so get back to the device. Earlier on from that, back into the early 2000s, I did a big series of billboard paintings, which were about placing an image within the landscape. So it was like this artificial thing. We all know as we race down freeways that we got these big images, this big artificial. So we're both dealing with the natural landscape or the built landscape, but we're also dealing with all this other information. And I kind of like the way that sort of operates as a sort of kind of a weird abstraction of reality. So those earlier pictures were that. And this was, in a sense, is kind of a return to this idea of sort of placing one image on top of another, so you're sort of building up layers. I mean, it's probably ripe for a lot more investigation, and we'll see what happens.
It's the asymmetry and even...
Yeah, like I deliberately made it sort of a bit skewed and a bit cockeyed. That was kind of important for me, but then, you know, the actual racing quality, that blur that's within the picture built into it, sort of accentuates that as well. So it was... But that picture itself emerged after this picture and a few of the others. And I suppose I kind of thought it's always nice to sort of throw something into a show which, even though these have a very strong family resemblance in the sense of their feeling, this one I thought, well, why not? That would be kind of interesting just to flip it and it sort of become, you know, of interest to me to make it. But I kind of felt the rest of them, because the rest were pretty much all vertical format. There was something about, you know, just this more, not stateliness, it's the wrong word, but the kind of the uprightness of these pictures, which it would have been, I don't know if I could have integrated that device into them. This seemed kind of right because it kind of refers to landscape and the speediness, but also the sort of the way we have to rationalize different realities as we move through landscape. So that's kind of it. And I sort of, you know, it's just interesting playing around. There was a lot of adjustment about, you know, how much of a perspective should be in that picture. And I kind of arrived at a middle point actually. But but some people are perplexed by that. I sent an image to a friend who's quite critical of what I do.
And you're still friends?
And he said, you know, I'm perplexed. And I went, well, that's a, you know, perplexed.
Could have been good.
Yeah, it's a kind of non-committal sort of thing, but it's also like, you know, I've sort of grabbed these images and sort of twisted them a bit.
Yeah.
Which, you know, I mean, all this stuff is stuff that can feed or not feed into future work, and those kind of things emerge. These all kind of emerged out of, this picture was the first. and it was being made at the same time I was making a show for down in Melbourne, another body of work, which was all about hoardings and flat things. And that was very much about a kind of a satire on modernist flatness. So the things like tags, I was copying tags like by flicking to make it look like aerosol, and thinking about wood grain and thinking about strange physiognomy.
Yeah, physiognomies.
In these pictures. And I suppose this one emerged kind of out of that somehow, and I thought, well, okay, there's two trajectories here. So I kind of worked on the two bodies of work together, and then we decided to show one in Melbourne, and this work came up here. But that show in Melbourne was much more austere in a sense, and the image, because they were dealing with this something funny modernist flatness, that had a different relation to the edge. And it'd be interesting to see that one in contrast. So continuing on this theme of time, I'd like to share a little more Deleuze. So in his book on Kant, Deleuze says, time is out of joint, time is unhinged. As long as time remains on its hinges, it is subordinate to movement. It is the measure of movement, interval or number. But time out of joint signifies the reversal of the movement-time relationship. It is now movement which is subordinate to time. Everything changes, including movement. We move from one labyrinth to another. The labyrinth is no longer a circle or a spiral, but a thread, a straight line. Now, I just want to note here that Deleuze is not referring to the quote-unquote Western arrow of time, where time marches on and we simply have to keep up. Rather, he's referring to this straight line as a cut in the circle. Not a cut that happens once or twice, but rather a cut that recurs. I want to sort of invite you to comment on this idea, right? So if you think of the natural world and this recurrence of time, like even in the way that the planet goes around the sun, and you have the seasons and so on and so forth. So you see all these cycles in nature. They're repetitive, but then it's like consciousness stepping in and breaking the circle. And that's what Deleuze is drawing out of that Hamlet quote, right? Time is out of joint. And I wonder if that bears any relation to the work here, because obviously you have nature as a kind of inspiration that you bring in, but then you have the consciousness of the viewer that's continually being maybe disrupted, and time being disrupted in that way. Just wanting you to comment on Well, you
that.
have time, you have the consciousness of the viewer, and you have the self-consciousness of the artist.
Yes.
Because artists are pretty self-conscious. I mean, there's a lot of art. There are artists that just, I was about to...
Spray.
I was about to say they vomited out.
You can say that.
You also, I don't know, it's kind of curious in the studio. I'm not that self-conscious, but you are kind of self-conscious, particularly as you accumulate a body of work and eventually they're going to be exhibited. You do start to think about relationships and how the group of things, talk to each other. As far as, velocity of time going forward, it's sort of curious. I try to travel when I can. I mean, we should be paying down the mortgage, but often we book something and we go away. And I kind of see that as kind of this way of cutting time.
All right.
This is how I do it in my just to sort of turn into a biographic sort of anecdote. It feels like things are just plummeting forward, and then this slice of time which you take yourself out of the situation, out of the studio, and go and absorb new things, and then you can sort of insert yourself back in a bit later. Yeah. So there's this kind of this gap. So I just related really distinctly, specifically to that sort of biographical aspect of. But I suppose through selection of specific images, I mean, there's thousands of images that relate to these that I have. Then you make a decision, and that is it becomes a very subjective thing. I mean, you sort of this way or that way, and then you make these decisions, and then that becomes like a cut in a sense, like you're you're extracting, you're cutting and extracting. And then putting that over there, and then the thing, maybe squeeze it up again. But that's about all I could say about that. But except to say that I think it is, you know, they are episodes. Each one of these is like a fraction of a second in a sense. They're like a glimpse. It's a glimpse. The glimpse thing I keep mentioning, William de Kooning, and relating to like freeways and signage and things as well. When he became very wealthy, and you know, I'm a big student of American modernism. He got wealthy enough that he could buy a place out in the Hamptons. I think it was way out on the edge, Montauk. But he used to get into town a lot. But he'd race back and forth, and they'd be driving on the freeways. And he made a whole series of pictures in the late 50s into the 60s, which the very gestural pictures he made, which are very wide brushes, and they're quite abstract. They have no figurative references really, apart from a feeling of landscape or a feeling of movement. And he talked about the glimpse. That's what he was after. He was after this sort of sense of the glimpse. He didn't want to stare it in the face. He just wanted to get that sensation as he flickered past.
Yep.
And then try to translate that sensation into a form which he could find satisfying. And I've kind of always, you know, for many years subscribed to that idea. I mean, Rauschenberg was the other one who I was particularly interested in. He's the sort of, his attitude is closer to the other body of work that I've made recently, where he says, if you need subject for your painting, for your art, take a walk around the block. And if you don't find it, just walk around again. And basically he's saying that it's all there. The subject is there. You just go around, walk around a few times and look, and you'll find subject. So between the glimpse and the walking around the block is kind of where my work is. Okay. And sometimes I privilege the walking around the block, and you know, the detritus and the detail. Yes. And other times I privilege this more generalized, pulling back from the landscape and getting that sort of feeling of it moving through.
Yeah, okay.
And each of them, I suppose, is in a sense a cut into time, just to close that circle.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so the glimpse, you know, the cut into time, I want to bring in this third theme that, you know, we want to inquire into, which is this idea of self-divergence, which is a strange concept, right? Because we think about self as continuum, like I'm myself and I've always been myself. So, but it came up in a conversation, the pre-talk that we had, you know, in preparation for this. I think you mentioned your work as self-divergent.
I don't quite remember that, but I kind of know what you mean.
Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth.
I might have been just jumbling, and like I was probably trying to say two things at once.
Okay, but in any case, it's an interesting concept, and you know, there are some things in here that I will read shortly. But what does self-divergence mean to you, whether in work or even as an artist?
Well, now you bring it up.
Yeah.
This is kind of, I suppose I was thinking, if I was, you know, just analysing what I might have been trying to say, a lot of artists have, and I'm not trying to be too like analysing, a lot of artists have a particular, I'm thinking like someone like Robert Hunter, you know, the abstract painter.
Sure.
Who was one of the artists who, as a local artist in Melbourne, really, I was really drawn to his work as a teenager. I mean, he had basically a kind of a system. He changed the system slightly over time, but he pretty much had a system. Mm-hmm. And he kind of stayed on that trajectory. It wasn't so much a trajectory, it was kind of, with Robert, it was kind of like even straight through. You know, they got more complex at times, they got more like less complex, more reductive, but they were kind of, with my work, and this is where I refer back to my website, you know, if you had a look, just a casual look at some point, and I sometimes look and go, oh, you know, what am I doing? Like my work, my boredom factor, I suppose, in the studio sort of, you know, it has a finite period every 6 months or a year or maybe 18 months. I kind of feel I need to sort of shovel new subject in or go off on a tangent. So it's more about tangents, going off on tangents. I see it all making sense as far as subject, whether, you know, as I've alluded to, you know, the close at hand or the expansive, or the pernickety or the general.
So self-tangential.
Yeah, so it's kind of like that, and it's not necessarily it's not a great way to necessarily run a public career, if you're thinking career-wise, because people they like sort of a consistent look, and so now I'm getting into sort of, you know, the neurosis of artists and, you know, their careers. But
we can delve into.
You know, it'd be nice to be able to just sort of fine tune. You know, take that rock and just polish it and keep polishing the same rock over time. But you know, that's not me. But all artists' motivations are different. You know, you know, everyone's pretty unique, and so the divergence is this kind of like, one minute there's riverscapes, next minute I'm sort of staring at the faciality that's emerging out of a plywood piece of wood or something, and kind of finding that really interesting, and, you know, trying to reconcile all that as a sort of
okay, so there's a diversity in it.
Yeah.
I want to read something. So this is from Daniela Voss, continuing on this theme of time. So in antiquity, the theory of time was bound up with the concept of an enclosed geocentric cosmos, and time was thought as the measure of the movement of cycles, which we talked about. Deleuze invokes the images of a serpent which unrolls itself, or a circle that snaps. Pure and empty time, so once this circle has snapped, is now the true subjectivity. It has become an infinite straight line which will cut right through the consciousness of the subject. Its effect is tortuous and inhuman. I like this part. Speaking about neuroses of the artist and so forth, in the sense that it carries the subject to the border of the livable and destroys the well-constituted identity of the subject. Can you, I don't know, do you have any sort of key moments in your career where you felt like, okay, time has snapped for me and I'm now going to, you know, go in this direction, or, you know, approach art in a way that perhaps I wasn't approaching it before?
I think there are periods where I just stop working for a while. Okay. And I think that kind of, and then it just becomes, I need a spark to come back into the work. Yeah. When I say that, it sounds like I'm just like goofing off. It's not like that. I'm in the studio, generally in the studio, or I'm traveling, but I'm not hanging around the house much. Yeah. So there are those sort of moments, and it just comes down to this, you know, what's going to spark new interest.
And do you have some of these sparks, like that, you know, that you can recall, or what was the spark for this particular exhibition?
I think I was, when I was working on this other body of work, which was about flatness and modernist space, I'd already kind of been thinking about these, and they were kind of sitting there, and we'd just been in New York recently, and we'd gone up the Hudson River and looking at the river, and gone up to Dia to look at, you know, a whole lot of modernist, you know, iconic modernist sculpture and painting. You know, whether it's to everyone's taste or not, I don't know, but it's kind of, I found it really interesting. But you also have the natural world that you're sort of spinning, you know, whipping through, and maybe it was just, these were about trying to reconcile some of that. Maybe just was kind of like an antidote to the work I'd been working on. Because through COVID, I'd worked on, there was a whole big series called Shoegazer. And Shoegazer shoegaze is a type of independent British music where the musicians stand around staring at their shoes and just sort of, and they play kind of a droney music, and there's, you know, the Cure at the very commercial end of it, and then they've got much more sort of droney. But I like that idea of you were just sort of concentrating on what's just down here and doodling around. So I made like a whole series of drawings while we were sort of trapped at home in coloured pencil, which was the first time I'd really used coloured pencil in 30 or 40 years. I've forgotten how amazing coloured pencil is. You know, you can, you know, it's, you know, I don't know. Anyway, it was kind of, it's strange that I haven't really embedded in myself for so long. So I made these pictures, which were very much about, because they were petite pictures, the subject became very close at hand. And then that led to a big series of big, quite colourful paintings. A lot of colour, unlike this show. A lot of oranges and yellows and blues, and they're all about sort of mashing together all the stuff that you see out in the built environment. I think I've gone off on a tangent from your subject, but then I suppose these having done all that and got quite kind of fiddly on a technical level. I mean, it was very satisfying. I really love it as a group of images. And then that sort of kind of segued into these silver pictures, because I found in a couple of them I started to use silver because it sort of mirrored the sort of metallic surface, and it's one of those forms that is sort of colours that isn't necessarily found in the natural world as much as. Yeah. You might see a silvery glitter, in a gum tree that's catching the light in a certain way, but you don't see a lot of silver naturally in the landscape. So I kind of, that sort of perverse thing of well, first of all, taking that and applying it to these other subjects, but then taking that and applying it to a landscape motif. I kind of like the idea, because the other thing is my work's often dealt with light. I mean, light has been a constant subject, whether it's like hovering spotlights or sort of refulgence. There is a word that I'm struggling for. Over horizon lines and things. Then there's a more famous series, but probably I became best known for in the late 80s, early 90s, which were these hovering lights and landscapes, and which are all about like movement through landscape as well, and sort of the abstraction that happens in the nocturne. And with these, like applying the silver, this is a silver pigment. It's actually aluminium, which is it's just ground down into like a powder aluminium. So the frame, curiously, the frames are made of the same thing the paintings are made of. Well, certainly that part of the painting. I like the way that sort of catches the light and flashes. And if these were turned to face the window and you have the sun coming across during the day, the character of them would change quite dramatically. The ones we actually showed at Tolano in the small new gallery on the side there has this bank of east-facing windows. And these pictures look, they just sucked the light in. It was so lovely to see. Because I often, because I use a lot of dark tones, I can get quite neurotic about the lighting in my work. But this silver can sort of handle anything really. It's tough and it can handle any light. But that kind of relates back to my interest in, a long-standing interest in light as well. Sure. Which I suppose has something to do with, sort of one aspect of landscape is, and the way light operates and changes. Yeah, sure. And that brings me to the photographic quality in the work. Can you tell us something about that? Yeah, I suppose I'd put it this way. They do have, in a sense, their surface is kind of photographic. The device of the border, I sort of call it I call it a sly nod towards photography. But in fact, by saying that, it's kind of, oh yeah, I mean, that's obvious. So it's not really sly at all. It's kind of a bit sort of straightforward. But for me... Straightforwardly sly. Yeah, but it's kind of... in a sense, it's formalising. Maybe it's a way of sort of trying to undercut people going, oh, they're so photographic. But in fact, these ones, like some of my work does look quite photographic. But in these, I don't think they're photographic at all. They might feel photographic, but then they're not photoreal. No. But they have something of the feeling of a type of silver gelatin print or something. Or there's a photographer, I think August Sander, is that it? It's an American photographer. Anyway, the previous body of work someone referred to, oh, you should look at his work and the way he deals with surface and subject and hoardings and footpaths. And I kind of, yes, and I thought, yes, I have actually looked at it. I've seen his work all the time, but I've never really kind of integrated it. He's never become someone that I've got books on and looked at. But so there's a photographer doing something similar to what this other body of work was. With these, there's always, I avoid choppy paint and thick paint. I don't know, it's just me. So they do tend to have a very even thing, and they sort of stay true to the, you can still see the grain of the weft and weave of the linen. So in that sense, they have a sort of the sheen of a photograph, but they're not photographic at all. I mean, they're quite painterly. Yet people see them as a PDF and they go, oh, are these photographs or are they paintings? But then, you know, this is the thing about painting, you've got to see it in real life.
Yeah.
You know, that's where it's activated. And that's where we talked about phenomena and stuff.
Yes.
Briefly, we touched on that in our pre-talk. I mean, that is kind of coming up to a paint, or, you know, painting of any quality or any, you know, sophistication or whatever. I mean, that is the phenomena, your relationship to it.
And tell us about...
but just to finish the photography thing, I mean, I take I've got like 30-something thousand photos on my iPhone. It's ridiculous. Yeah. One day it's going to crash and I'm going to lose all that stuff.
I hope it's in the cloud.
And, but it's kind of, but I just see it, I mean, it's just a tool for me, and these change quite dramatically. I mean, they might feel like they're photographic in the sense that from a photo, but they actually change quite dramatically in the process. The photo's kind of there, right, you know, an hour off of it, like I might be referring to it, and then they pretty much, it's abandoned. Yeah, so. And
so the phenomena of, in this case, water, trees and shadows of trees, why? And
yeah,
what
why?
can you say?
Yeah, why?
Yeah.
I don't know. I've always found, I mean, I often think of myself more as an image maker than a painter or a photographer. So it's kind of, it sort of comes down to, you know, I'd kind of be interested to see what that looked like made.
Okay.
You know, you can look at it as like a little study or something. But in the end, I'm just trying to satisfy myself. Like, they're not anecdotal in the sense they're not really telling stories. They're not didactic, and they're trying to sort of direct you in, like, you know, this is an issue I'm concerned about, and I will, and this is how I'm going to educate you, or, and that makes me probably kind of out of time would probably be a better way of putting it.
Appropriate.
And that's where kind of this neurosis about a neo-romantic impulse. I mean, that's very cool. I was interested to see how that would work, how those things mashed up together would work. I was interested to see how, by getting in and fiddly with this one in the, you know, in certain lights, you know, how all those things sort of go together. And I was interested in this one, which is the quite painted, that was sort of the more abstract picture. You know, how would that work? How does it work as an image? What feeling does it give me? What satisfaction do I get out of making it? So,
okay.
So in a sense, they're like, not exercises, but they're the formal result of a whole lot of inquiry.
Sure. And it just so happened that the water and the trees and the shadows.
Well, you know, it relates back to, you know, the fact that I've this travel and, you know, the certain bodies of water and things that I've sort of, you know, it's like, you know, you go back to a place that you've always loved, or you have, you know, nice memories of, or not nice memories of, that you're sort of dealing with on a psychological level. And, you know, painting, you know, as you can see, painting water is quite difficult. It's difficult, you know, and I could go, well, you know, I could critique every aspect of them and say, but it's not about that description, it's about the kind of the feeling, and, you know, can I translate that, the feeling and an image into something that's sort of satisfying. So, and it's the same with my photography, pretty much, which has been quite abstract at times. It's about sort of, how would this be?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you know, that kind of brings us to the end of our chat, but I wanted to invite anyone in the audience who might have an insight or a question that they want to share. And then the room fell silent.
I was thinking about Deleuze.
Yes.
This is Brent, my partner, everybody.
He died in 95.
Brent, that's right.
I'm reading Deleuze, and it's so general here. But he died in 95, and I wonder how his thinking would adjust to the new kind of quantum physics. You know, because quantum physics is kind of blasting all meaning out of the water, really. You know, like, and we still hang on to this fragile consciousness. You know, Deleuze was pretty fragile itself, you know, but goes in one ear and out the other for me.
Yeah.
But
I think, I mean, Deleuze didn't seem to inquire much into quantum physics, but he might have known about it because it's been around for a while, since the 1920s. But yeah.
and you're thinking about time, and I think just time just is to death.
Yeah, and Einstein, I think, has a relatively famous quote: "The time of the philosopher doesn't exist." And I think there's this juxtaposition between the time in physics and the time, lived time or experienced time, or an experience of time. And I think Deleuze is dealing with the latter more so than trying to give us a theory of how time works in the
He tried to
universe.
apply to paintings, static thing, in his approach to Francis Bacon's painting.
Yeah.
Which is still
yeah.
pretty complex.
Yes.
The thing of flip, which you were talking about very early on in the talk.
Flip, did you say?
Conceptualising, coming to an understanding of the thing that you're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
You can see it in one way, or you can see it in another way, and that you can actually enter into a kind of indeterminacy.
Yes.
The construction of the image can lead the mind, which is a machine for trying to make meaning,
Yes.
into a point where it's attempting to make sense of something.
Yeah.
And gets confounded and comes back to the start and tries another different direction.
Yes.
And that, in a sense, that's like quantum physics, because you jump in between various levels of state.
Yeah.
Maybe this works, but no, it flips down to another.
But it's almost not understandable.
No, it's not understandable. And that's what makes it something that you can
Well,
constantly evoke and employ to, if you can get the right mix of setting up the conditions to induce flips of consciousness all the time, then you have this process by which you can make an eye constantly engage with an image, because it's still trying to grapple with what it can make out of it.
It does.
Your image making here quite interesting in that regard, because you've got two elements, one which is very fixed, which are the components. It's like a river and it's in the landscape and it's got trees, and they're all physical entities which are there. But the actual thing that is mainly predominant in the image is flow.
Yeah.
Which is something which is moving past. So you've got this sense of a kind of dichotomy between the composition, which is very static, and the actual content of the image, which is something which is quite different entirely.
Yeah, well, it's kind of been pointed out in my work that there's kind of this weird dichotomy quite often. I'm trying to do two things at once. And I sort of go, oh, well, that must be my subject then, because it's been referred to, quite often. It just comes down to these are blurred to give us kind of a sense of that they're not fixed. So the blur that's in them, I mean, this picture was a little more hard-edged, the image, and then I sort of just blurred it, and because I wanted it to sort of be a bit indeterminate. But it was very important that it had this sort of structure through the middle. So just on a formal level, but it's meant to be, when I'm in my studio and I turn around and look at, say, a picture like that, I turn around and I glimpse it and I go, okay, that's kind of satisfying. And if I go in and start fiddling with it and try to sort of finesse it too much, then it becomes unsatisfying. So they really are about that sort of that glimpse of, and our relationship to the world. We're moving through the world, but we're also seeing things fixed within the world. And then I suppose then it comes down to archetypes and the way you divide pictures, talking about the picture plane, how you sort of formally construct things. So it's, all that stuff sort of piles in, really. And the time aspect is, I mean, when I make a little picture around the corner, like the little one around the corner, this takes very little time, in a traditional times arrow sense. I mean, that's quite satisfying, because it's kind of, that was a really intense little burst of activity, and that kind of, and forever that will now be that little fixed thing which I'll be able to refer to, whereas some of these other ones were fiddled with for months. And so they all have their own character. Just talking about picture making. But I do think, you know, with these and the device of this edge is about, I mean, there's something about fixing things with that, like fixing the image. So anyway.
Everything I like as a takeaway, just for the afternoon, a convert to tangentials and that. Yeah, a lot of perspectives.
Yeah.
Could be a whole movement, yes.
I actually enjoyed this interview because it was simplified, a lot of postmodern questions and a lot of modernist answers. So, you know, a lot of questions about disruption and time and formal answers. So, and I think there is a coming back of the formal, and there's a new attention to it. But do you think it's different now after we had, for example, Deleuze and postmodernism? Do we now look at formalism in a different way? Is it because everything goes in circles.
Well, exactly. I mean, I was about to say, I mean, that's a cycle thing, isn't it? And even if you go back into sort of 19th century or the 18th century, I mean, there's cycles even within those centuries as far as taste and what is kind of considered like correct or like valid as far as subject or approach. So, I mean, there's a lot of formal painting around these days again. But the formal painting, if I think about abstract painting, it's kind of, I think of like the difference between a Pierre Soulages painting, he's a French painter, significant, and then a Wade Guyton, who basically creates a similar feeling, but he does it by cramming linen through a printer. So he's kind of, in a sense, they're sort of, yeah, but they're not satirizing, they're sort of saying there's a whole lot of interesting formal things we can deal with, but we can do it in a different way, which just sort of changes the language. It's like a dialect. The dialect changes, but the basic language is the same. Yeah. And then, you know, there's a way...
The dialect gives the flavour to the language.
Sorry?
The dialect gives the flavour to the language.
That's it, it gives the flavour, exactly, thank you. Yeah, it does. It makes it interesting, and it contemporizes it, because it's like slang, I suppose. But, you know, things come and go, and, you know, since postmodernism, you know, things can come and go, and we can do, you know, we can go back there or not. I mean, sometimes I see, because I follow a lot of the young artists, you know, coming out of Melbourne and go and see shows and things, and you can be very cynical and say, oh, I've seen this before, you know, how many more monochromes can be made? But for them it's new, it's kind of new, and it's kind of different, and the material is a little different, the scale is different, and, you know, and I think, yeah, so, you know, things pop up again, you know, people make blurry landscapes. They've made, you know, Whistler, you go way back, you go look into the background of some, you know, very early pictures, you know. Clarice Beckett. We went to a Clarice Beckett, the big show down in Geelong that's just opened. And there was a big show I had at Bendigo Art Gallery many years ago, a survey of a decade of work or so. And the opening speaker talked about Clarice Beckett. And I hadn't really thought about Clarice Beckett. And in fact, the work that was in the show really didn't have much of a relationship. I think he just plucked that one out of the air. But going down and seeing Clarice, who made these beautiful tonal pictures of this sort of, generally her scale is about that. They sometimes get a bit bigger. I mean, she's dealing with the effects of light and, you know, the impression. I mean, they're all done en plein air, or en plein storm. In her case, she'd paint outdoors during thunderstorms and things. I mean, there's certain, you know, I mean, there's a kind of a finite way of, you know, number of ways of making a picture. You can...
meaning is very hard to locate too nowadays. You know, Jenny makes work that is really personal. Your work is generated from your life, isn't it? You know, mine is generated psychologically, Jenny's is psychological. Andrew's is psychological, but there's a distance in... Yours is kind of like right there. Mine is kind of psychologically...
Because both
comes out in a madder way, whereas Andrew's is in relation to the way that he visualises the world in a more real way.
And I suppose Jenny and your work kind of has the figurative element inevitably makes it going. It's going to be read in an anecdotal story. There's a story here, or there's a figure in a field. You know, I'm just thinking of that figure in the taxi. In one of your latest pictures, you know, the taxi driving off into the distance immediately makes you think of someone either setting out on a journey or someone leaving a situation that they want to get out, or a whole lot of stuff like that.
Except for if it's Francis Bacon.
Yeah, or in Brent's case, you know, the strange orifices and all this sort of, you know, you know, there's a type of figurative painting lends itself immediately to the narrative, and I suppose these are only narrative in the sense that they are a glimpse, you know.
And pin down meaning today, I think, you know, like Deleuze, you could not pin down Deleuze, you know, and physics, you know, quantum physics is really stuffing up everything, you know, it even makes religion look possible. You know, and it makes religious belief look possible, you know, because bloody hell, you know, like we're just expected to think this universe is just expanding and this. You know, and it's like time, there's no end to it, and it's like, where does it ends for us?
Yes.
Consciously.
And where's the bloody cat?
Is it dead or alive? Did you, we might wrap up. We can continue the conversations, of course.
Any other questions? No?
Just before, so thank you, Alan, and for those who don't know, Alan's our philosopher in residence, and he is going to continue to have these conversations with our artists as we go through the year, and I'm finding them extremely interesting, and each one's so different, obviously depending on the artist, but they're very good. And thank you, Alan, for doing that.
Pleasure.
Thank you to Andrew and to Brent, who have been in Brisbane this week and travelled from Melbourne, and thank you for the exhibition. It's wonderful to have these works in Brisbane,
And thank you.
Thank you so much. Please stay on and have a drink and chat to Andrew and to Brent as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
It was fun.
It was okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope it was okay for you.
Yeah, it was fun. That's good. That's good. Thank you.
Thanks, that was great.